I was hesitant to go all the way through Walden with Thoreau, but now we saw Thoreau had reached the top of the book pile. He was at the top of the heap with at the bookstore. He had reached the very peak. He was number one at the top of the heap at the bookstore. So he's risen in fame. And we enjoyed reading it, and I didn't want to go through it again, but now I want to be more thorough with Thoreau. Hmm. Did you see how he was at the top of the book pile at the bookstore? Look at who's on top.
Oh, I didn't notice that.
Thoreau.
Yeah, it took so long now. With the environment, they come to Thoreau.
Yeah, they made this book pile and they put him on the top of the pile.
You see, they promote
This is supposed to be a very chic, yuppie bookstore in Williamsburg and Spoonbill. Now, Thoreau had reached the top. Finally, he was the bestseller.
After we ruined the environment, just come
now
back to Thoreau.
Now that the environment's ruined, his book has become a bestseller, but so it's taking up a lot of paper. Even more trees are being cut to make Thoreau's book, Walden, is now being marketed. So now the environment's even worse than it was. Former inhabitant, we're going to read the former inhabitant.
At least one book for which the trees would not care, you know.
The trees themselves support the promotion of.
They like to be sacrificed, a few trees, to save the rest.
Yeah, the trees now are.
To make the book, because you
the
made
tree
the
fund.
possession that the book now will ruin the rest. God.
My tree fund with the tree tax is now going towards the production of Walden books. The foundation of trees. Former inhabitants and winter visitors. We come to former inhabitants. Who was there before Walden? Winter visitors. We're still in the winter. So we're in the winter ourselves. It's already 3 minutes and I haven't started reading. So I don't like when people are not patient, so I make them wait. And they can be kicked out. They can just drop out. If you can't listen patiently, then get off.
You're not patient.
I'm not patient?
No,
I would never tolerate this kind of reader for a second. I would just immediately get off.
What about when you drive?
What?
When you drive, you're not patient.
I'm not a patient driver. No one now. We're talking about current society and how everyone's rushing everywhere, and that's another reason to read Walden. No one's patient driving their cars. You know how when somebody double parks or something, or they're slow at the light, is the cause for honking, like a goose. You honk at them. I weathered some merry snowstorms and spent some cheerful winter evenings. Do you have cheerful winter evenings by a fireside? Do you feel this is a cheerful morning by the heater? A cheerful winter morning reading Walden, while the snow whirled wildly without, and even the hooting of the owl was hushed. For many weeks I met no one in my walks but those who came occasionally to cut wood and shed it to the village. Remember, I used to jog in the morning, and one time I saw the owl. He said, "What are you doing out so early?" I asked what he was up so late, why he was still working at dawn. And asked why I was up so early. The elements, however, abated me in making a path through the deepest snow in the woods. For when I had once gone through, gone through, the wind blew the oak leaves into my tracks where they lodged, and by absorbing the rays of the sun melted the snow, and so not only made a dry bed for my feet, but in the night that dark line was my guide, for human society was obliged to conjure up the former occupants of these woods within the memory of many of my townsmen. The road near which my house stands resounded with laugh and gossip of inhabitants, and the woods which border it was notched and dotted here and there with its little gardens and dwellings, though it was then much more shut in by the forest than now. In some places within my own remembrance the pines would scrape both sides of a chase at once, and women and children who were compelled to go this way to Lincoln alone and on foot did it with fear, and often ran a good part of the distance, though mainly but a humble route to neighboring villages. Or for the woodman's team. It once amused the traveller more than now by its variety, and lingered longer in his memory. Where now firm open fields stretch from the village to the woods, it then ran through a maple swamp, on a foundation of logs, the remnants of which doubtless still underlie the present dusty highway from the Stratton, now the almshouse farm, to Blister Hill. Are we going to Concord in the spring to explore all these sites and dig up some of Thoreau's beans? We can get descendants from his bean field. East of my bean field, across the road, lived Cato Ingraham, slave of a Duncan Ingraham, Esquire, gentleman of Concord village, who built his slave a house and gave him permission to live in Walden woods. Cato not Itacensis, but Concordensis. Some say that he was a Guinea Negro. There are a few who remember his little patch among the walnuts, which he let grow up till he should be old and need them. But a younger and whiter speculator got them at last. Yeah, I was thinking about the walnut trees, like on Smith. There's the old farm that Hiram Smith was in, what came up for sale. But they said it was now no good because all the walnut trees had been cut down. It had a beautiful grove of walnut trees, which are very valuable. Maybe they should be replaced to its former glory.
They should plant some trees in those big farms.
You think I should plant walnut trees on the former Smith home? I could plant walnut trees in memory. He too, however, occupies an equally narrow house at present. Maybe that's what I should be, as a tree planter. Maybe I found my profession. What I could do is get an airplane and drop these seed bombs, and I could drop up to 1 billion trees.
Throughout the Midwest.
I could fly this plane, and they say I could plant
trees like the birds do.
1 billion trees a year.
That would drive this thing.
A I just drop seed bombs from a plane and plant them everywhere by force.
All the
Military.
times.
With the military, if I can get control of the military, to convert all the planes to tree bombing. Well, tree planting, the military.
Seed bombing.
I think the military should convert their planes to tree planting.
That'd be good.
All the drones could probably plant too. Anyways, Cato have obliterated, cellar hole still remains, though known to few, being concealed from the traveler by a fringe of pines. It is now filled with the smooth sumac. And here's the Latin name, Ruus clapa, capra, and one of the earliest species of goldenrod. See, he specifies the Latin name for these species because he's like a botanist. Solidago stricta grows there luxuriantly. Here, by the very corner of my field, still nearer to town, Selfa, a colored woman, had her little house, where she spun linen for the townsfolk, making the Walden woods ring with her shrill singing, for she had a loud and notable voice. At length, in the War of 1812, her dwelling was set on fire by English soldiers. Do you know that in Connecticut, the people who had their farms and houses set on fire by the English, right, were then granted land in Ohio called the Firelands as a makeup. So they could then move to get some like almost free land in Ohio or cheap land. And did you know that Connecticut at this time theoretically stretched all the way across to California in the strip? And so the location, this little band where Connecticut is, crosses over Ohio through Cleveland. And in that little stretch is called the Firelands, and Cleveland is the connection of Cleveland to the East Coast is the Firelands. And this happens around the War of 1812. Her dwelling was set on fire by English soldiers, prisoners on parole when she was away, and her cat and dog and hens were all burned up together. She led a hard life and somewhat inhumane. One old frequenter of these woods remembers that as he passed her house one noon, she heard her muttering herself over her gurgling pot, "Ye are all bones, bones. I have seen bricks amid the oak corpse there." Now, this happened to her 1812, but Thoreau is writing about 1845. Down the road on the right, on Brister's Hill, lived Brister Freedman, quote, "a handy Negro, a slave of Squire Cummings once, there where grew still the apple trees which Brister planted and tended. Large old trees now, but the fruit still wild and ciderish to my taste." Not long since I read this epitaph in the old Lincoln burying ground, a little on one side, near the unmarked graves of some British grenadiers who fell in the retreat from Concord, where she is styled Scipio Brister, Scipio Africanus. He had some title to be called, quote, "a man of color." So he's a man of color. As if he were discolored. It also told me with staring emphasis when he died, which was but an indirect way of informing me that he ever lived. With him dwelt Fenda, his hospitable wife, who told fortunes, yet pleasantly, round and large and round and black, blacker than any of the children of night, such a dusty orb as never rose on Concord before or since. Further down the hill on the left, on the old road, in the woods, are marks of some homestead of the Stratton family, whose orchard once covered all the slope of Brister's Hill, but was long since killed out by pitch pines, excepting a few stumps whose old roots furnish still the wild stalks of many a thrifty village tree. Nearer yet to town, you come to Breed's location on the other side of the way, just on the edge of the wood. Ground famous for the pranks of a demon not distinctly named in old mythology, who has acted a prominent and astonishing part in our New England life, and deserves as much as any mythological character to have his biography written one day. Who first comes in the guise of a friend or hired man, and then robs and murders the whole family. New England rum. Goodness. Did you write a biography of New England rum and how it affected people? But history must not yet tell the tragedies enacted here. Let time intervene in some measure to assuage and lend to an azure tint to them. Here the most indistinct and dubious tradition says that once a tavern stood, the well the same, which tempered the traveller's beverage and refreshed the steed. Here then men saluted one another, and heard and told the news, and went their ways again. Breed's hut was standing only a dozen years ago, though it had long been unoccupied. It was about the size of mine. It was set on fire by mischievous boys one election night, if I did not mistake. I lived on the edge of the village then, and I had just lost myself over Devon Bont's Gondabart that winter that I labored with a lethargy which, by the way, I never knew whether to regard as a family complaint, having an uncle who goes to sleep shaving himself, and is obliged to sprout potatoes in a cellar Sundays, in order to keep awake and keep the Sabbath, or as the consequence of my attempt to read Chalmers' collection of English poetry without skipping. I fairly overcame my nervii, Nervii. I had just sunk my head on this when the bells rung fire, and in the hot haste the engines rolled that way, led by a straggling troop of men and boys, and I among the foremost, for I had leaped the brook. He thought it was far south of the woods we who had run to fires before, barn, shop, or dwelling house, or all together. It's Baker's barn, cried one. Trying to remember, how did the Smith barn burn down? The back barn. Was it electrical? I can't remember. We had a barn, the back barn once, I guess, burnt down. How did that happen? Well, anyways, it is the Codman place, affirmed another, and then fresh sparks went up above the wood, as if the roof fell in, and we all shouted, quote, Concord to the rescue. Wagons shot past with furious speed and crushing loads, bearing perchance, among the rest, the agent of the insurance company, It was bound to go, however far, and ever and anon the engine bell tinkled behind, more slow and sure, and the rearmost of all, as it were afterward whispered, came they who set the fire and gave the alarm. Interesting, the insurance company agent is going to the fire. It's very Protestant to have insurance. Do you think they were Protestants? Thus we kept on like true idealists, rejecting the evidence of our senses, until at a turn in the road we heard the crackling and actually felt the heat of the fire from over the wall, and realized, alas, that we were there. The very nearness of the fire but cooled our ardor. At first we thought to throw a frog pond on to it, but concluded to let it burn. It was so far gone and so worthless, so we stood round our engine, jostled one another, expressed our sentiments through speaking trumpets, and in lower tone referred to the great conflagrations which the world had witnessed, including Boscombe's shop. And between ourselves we thought that, were we there in season with our tub, quote tub, T-U-B, and a full frog pond by, we could turn that threatened last and universal one into another flood. We finally retreated without doing any mischief, returned to sleep, and Gondibert. But as for Gondibert, I would accept that passage in the preface about wit being the soul's powder. Wit being the soul's powder. Where do you think was the source of wit? Wit comes from the soul. It's one thing just to be smart or to be funny, but do you think wit comes out of the soul? Maybe the strength of the soul? Wit being the soul's powder, quote, but most of mankind are strangers to wit, as Indians are to powder. It chanced that I walked that way across the fields the following night, about the same hour, and hearing a low mourning at the spot, I drew near in the dark, and discovered the only survivor of the family that I knew, an heir of both its virtues and its vices, who alone was interested in this burning, lying on his stomach and looking over the cellar wall at the still smoldering cinders beneath, muttering to himself, as is his wont. W-O-N-T. Look up that word. It says want. What's his want? What's my want? As my want. We are reading Walden as it is my want. He had been working far off in the river meadows all day, and had improved the first moments that he could call his own to visit the house of his fathers and his youth. He gazed into the cellar from all sides and points of view, by turns, always lying down to it, and as if there was some treasure which he remembered concealed beneath the stones, where there was absolutely nothing but a heap of bricks and ashes. The house being gone, he looked at what there was left. He was soothed by the sympathy which my mere presence implied, and showed me, as well as the darkness permitted, where the well was covered up, which, thank heaven, could never be burned. You can't burn a well. I wonder why. And he groped long about the wall to find the well swept which his father had cut, and well sweep which his father had cut and mounted, feeling for the iron hook or staple by which a burden had been fastened to the heavy end all that he could now cling to convince me that it was no common writer. I felt it and still remark it almost daily in my walks, for by it hangs the history of a family. Is that saying like the only thing left was the well or something? One more on the left, where are seen the well and lilac bushes by the wall, and now open field lived nutting and by Grassi, but to return towards Lincoln, farther in the woods than any of these, where the road approaches nearest to the pond. Wyman the potter squatted and furnished his townsmen with earthenware, and left descendants to succeed him. You see how he observes all his neighbors? Now you know why I'm like observe and meet all the neighbors on our block. Because
Be careful.
be careful to meet too many neighbors. Don't in New York you don't meet so many neighbors. Neither were they rich in worldly goods, holding the land by suffrage while they lived, and there often the sheriff came in vain to collect the taxes, and attached a chip for form's sake, as I have read in his accounts, there being nothing else that he could lay his hands on. One day in midsummer, when I was hoeing, a man who was carrying a load of pottery to market stopped his horse against my field and inquired concerning Wyman the younger. He had long ago bought a potter's wheel of him, and wished to know what had become of him. But I had read of the potter's play and wheel in Scripture, but it had never occurred to me that the pots we used were not such as had come down unbroken from those days, or grown on trees like gourds somewhere. I was pleased to hear that so fictile an art was ever practiced in my neighborhood. He says there was a potter. The last habitant of these woods before me was an Irishman, Hugh Quoil. Quoil. Quoil, if I have spelt his name with coil enough. Did I pronounce it with enough coil? You Quoil. Quail, who occupied Wyman's tenement. Colonel Quoil, he was called. Rumor said that he had been a soldier at Waterloo. Wow. If he had lived, I should have made him fight his battles over again. He would have wanted to tell him the story of his battle. So that Waterloo is like, isn't it like 1812 or something? So that would be like 30 years ago. So his trade here was that of a ditcher. Napoleon went to St. Helena. Quail came to Walden Woods. All I know of him is tragic. He was a man of manners, like one who had seen the world, and was capable of more civil speech than you could well attend to. He wore a greatcoat in midsummer, being affected with the trembling delirium, and his face was the color of carmine. He died in the road at the foot of Blister's Hill shortly after I came to the woods, so that I have not remembered him as a neighbor. Before his house was pulled down, when his comrades avoided it as a, quote, an unlucky castle, I visited it. There lay his old clothes, curled up by use as if they were himself, upon his raised plank bed. Plank bed, you know what that is? It's sort of like it's the board. The bottom is just boards, and I guess. His pipe lay broken on the hearth instead of a bowl broken at the fountain. The last could never have been the symbol of his death, for he confessed to me that, though he had heard of Brister Spring, we going to Brister Spring when we go to Concord? He had never seen it, and soiled cards, kings of diamonds, spades, and hearts were scattered over the floor. These are cards, playing cards. One black chicken, which the administrator could not catch, black as night, as silent, not even croaking, awaiting Reynard. Still went to roost in the next apartment. He has a black chicken. Did you ever have black chickens? You did? I'm pretty sure our chickens were white.
Red.
You had red chickens? We're reading this because we are authentic, original farmers from rural areas. So we can speak about the chickens. In the rear there was the dim outline of a garden, which had been planted but had never received its first hoeing, owing to those terrible shaking fits, though it was now harvest time. It was overrun with Roman wormwood and beggar ticks, which last struck to my clothes for all fruit. The skin of a woodchuck. I like the story of woodchucks in Walden. The skin of a woodchuck was freshly stretched upon the back of the house, a trophy of his last Waterloo. But no warm cap or mittens would he want more. So this is the guy who fought at Waterloo, and now he fought a woodchuck. Now only a dent in the earth marks the site of these dwellings, with buried cellar stones and strawberries, raspberries, thimbleberries, hazel bushes, sumacs growing in the sunny sward. You know what a sunny sward is? S-W-A-R-D. There's another of our word collection. Sward. I wish I had a sunny sward. Sunny sward there. Some pitch pine or gnarled oak occupies what was the chimney nook, and a sweet-scented black birch perhaps waves where the doorstone was. Sometimes the well dent is visible where once a spring oozed, now dry and tearless grass, for it was covered deep, not to be discovered till some late day with a flat stone under the sod where the last of the race departed. What a sorrowful act must that be, the covering up of wells, coincident with the opening of wells of tears. Do you think that you cover up wells when you have a well of tears? When something comes to an end, you fill in the well during the time that you have tears. So if somebody dies, you fill in their well while you're crying. The sorrowful act must that be, the covering up of wells, coincident with the opening of wells of tears. These cellar dents, like deserted fox burrows, old holes, are all that is left when once were the stir and bustle of human life, and, quote, fate, free will, foreknowledge, absolute, unquote, in some form and dialect or other were by turns discussed. But all I can learn of their conclusion amounts to just this, that, quote, Cato and Brewster pulled wool, unquote, which is about as edifying as the history of more famous schools of philosophy. Still grows the vivacious lilac a generation after the verdure and lintel and the sill are gone, unfolding its sweet scented flowers each spring, to be plucked by the musing traveler, planted and tended once by children's hands in front yard plots, now standing by wall sides in retired pastures, and giving place to new rising forest. The last of that stirp, sole survivor of that family, little did the dusty children think that the puny slip with its two eyes only, which they stuck in the ground, in the shadow of the house, and daily watered, would root itself so and outlive them, and the house itself in the rear that shaded it, and the grown man's garden and orchard, and tell their story faintly to the lone wanderer of half a century after they had grown up and died, blossoming as fair and smelling as sweet as in that first spring. I mark it still tender, civil, cheerful lilac colors. So if we plant all those billions of trees by the plane bombs, tree bombs, they'll be around long after we're gone. If you, I don't know what it is. I guess if you want to have an orchard, the sooner you plant, the better. But the small village germ of something more, why did it fail? While Concord keeps its ground, were there no natural advantages, no water privileges, sourced with the deep Walden pond, and cool Brewster spring, privileged to drink long and healthy draughts at these, all unimproved by these men, but to dilute the glass. They were universally a thirsty race. Might not the basket and stable broom, mat-making, corn-parching, linen-spinning, and pottery business have thrived here, making the wilderness to blossom like the rose, and a numerous posterity have inherited the land of their fathers. The sterile soil would at least have been proof against a lowland degeneracy. Alas, how little does the memory of these human inhabitants, how little does the memory of these human inhabitants enhance the beauty of the landscape? Do they don't enhance the beauty of the landscape. How little. It's funny, our existence hardly impacts the beauty of the landscape. Our memory of our existence after we die, the little does the memory of us as inhabitants enhance the beauty of the landscape. Again, perhaps, nature will try with me for a first settler, and my house, raised last spring, to be the oldest in the hamlet. I am not aware that any man has ever built on the spot which I occupy. Deliver me from a city built on the site of a more ancient city, whose materials are ruins, whose gardens cemeteries, the soil is blanched and accursed there, and before that becomes necessary, the earth itself will be destroyed with such reminiscences. I repeopled the woods and lured myself to sleep. At this season I seldom had a visitor. When the snow lay deepest, no wanderer ventured near my house for a week or fortnight at a time. But there I lived in a as snug as a meadow mouse, or as cattle and poultry, which are said to have survived for a long time, buried in drifts. Do you think cows survive in a drift? Well, they stand up, and if they can breathe, maybe. But, long time buried in drifts, even without food, or like that early settlers' family in the town of Sutton, in this state, whose cottage was completely covered by the great snow of 1717. Wow, 1717, where he was absent, and an Indian found it only by the hole which the chimney's breath made in the drift, and so relieved the family. Wow. I remember the snow in Ohio of 1977, I think. My father had to rescue people with the tractor, the big tractor, the Steiger, the big four-wheel drive tractor. I remember the pictures of and the snow in the shop we have in the photo archives. But no friendly Indian concerned himself about me, nor needed he, for the master of the house was at home. The great snow, how cheerful it is to hear of. That's the great snow of 1717. When the farmers could not get to the woods and swamps with their teams, and were obliged to cut down the shade trees before their houses, and when the crust was harder, cut off the trees in the swamps 10 feet from the ground, as it appeared the next spring. In the deepest snows, the path which I used from the highway to my house, about a half a mile long, might have been represented by a meandering dotted line with wide intervals between the dots. For a week of even weather I took exactly the same number of steps, and of the same length, going and coming and going and stepping deliberately with the precision of a pair of dividers in my own deep tracks. To such routine the winter reduces us, yet often they were filled with the heaven's own blue. You know how in the TV show Apple TV under Emily, under Dickinson, they show they do they show Henry David Thoreau as walking, just going into town to Concord to have lunch with his mother on some days, and she does his laundry, and they depict him as not so much the hermit like you think of, that he's walking off into town. We don't know. Do you trust television shows? When they make up the history with Thoreau and Emily Dickinson? But no weather interfered fatally with my walks, or rather my going abroad, for I frequently tramped 8 or 10 miles through the deepest snow to keep an appointment with a beech tree, or a yellow birch, or an old acquaintance among the pines, when the ice and snow, causing their limbs to droop, and so sharpening their tops, had changed the pines into fir trees, wading to the tops of the highest hills, when the snow was nearly 2 feet deep on a level, and shaking down another snowstorm on my head at every step. Did you ever have the snow drop on your head when you're walking through the woods with heavy snow on the trees, and it just falls off on your head? Not when it's snowing, but when it's just sitting in the trees. The snowstorm on my head at every step, or sometimes creeping and floundering thither. These are our favorite words of Walden, thither. Thither, thither on my hands and knees, when the hunters had gone into winter quarters. One afternoon I amused myself by watching a barred owl, a strict nebulosa, sitting on one of the older, lower dead limbs of a white pine, Close to the trunk, in broad daylight, I standing within a rod of him. A rod. How long is a rod? It's an English thing. You have to be English. A rod is, I think, 16 feet, though I'm not very accurate because I'm not that English either. He could hear me when I moved and crouched the snow with my feet. Crunched, Cronched, the snow, with my feet, but could not plainly see me when I made most noise. He would stretch out his neck and erect his neck feathers and open his eyes wide, but their lids soon fell again, and he began to nod. I too felt a slumberous influence after watching him half an hour. Amazing he could watch an owl for half an hour. Well, you think that owl might fly away at, at one rod. As he sat thus with his eyes half open like a cat, winged brother of the cat. You know, they have like a rotating head. It's weird that way it rotates. There was only a narrow slit left between their lids by which he preserved a peninsular relation to me, thus with half-shut eyes, looking out from the land of dreams and endeavoring to realize me, vague object or mot, that interrupted his visions. At length, on some louder noise or my nearer approach, he would grow uneasy and sluggishly turn about on his perch as if impatient at having his dreams disturbed. And when he launched himself off and flapped through the pines, spreading his wings to unexpected breath, I could not hear the slightest sound from him. Thus guided amid the pine boughs, or rather by a delicate sense of their neighborhood than by sight, feeling his twilight way, as it were, with his sensitive pinions, he found a new perch, where he might in peace await the dawning of his day. That's the same thing happened to me. I was jogging and I scared an owl along the road and he flew away. As I walked over the long causeway made for the railroad through the meadows, I encountered many a blustering and nipping wind. Did we encounter a nipping wind yesterday? I was in New York yesterday, and it was December 20th, and there was a nipping wind. We had walked down to the water, and it was cold by the water, the wind blowing, nipping our faces. For nowhere has it freer play, and when the frost had smitten me on one cheek, my cheeks were smitten. Heathen as I was, I turned it the other also. Do you turn your other cheek to the nipping wind? Smitten. If your cheek is smitten by one wind, you can turn the other cheek to the wind. Be smitten. My cheek was smitten. Turn the other cheek. Turn the other cheek. To the smitten. Nipping. Turn the other cheek to the nipping wind. Nor was it much better by the carriage road from Brewster's Hill, for I came to town still like a friendly Indian, when the contents of the broad open fields were all piled up between the walls of the Walden road, and half an hour sufficed to obliterate the tracks of the last traveler. And when I returned, new drifts would have formed, which I floundered where the Busy northwest wind had been depositing the powdery snow round a sharp angle in the road, and not a rabbit's track, nor even the fine print. The small type of a meadow mouse was to be seen, yet I rarely failed to find, even in midwinter, some warm and springy swamp where the grass and the skunk-cabbage. I remember skunk-cabbage is in the swampy areas. Cool. Skunk-cabbage. I wonder if you can eat it. Doesn't sound very good. The grass and the skunk-cabbage still put forth with perennial verdure, and some hardier bird occasionally awaited the return of spring. We talked about turning the other cheek to the nipping wind, and the skunk-cabbage and the owl, and seeing the owl, and scaring the owl, and observing the owl while you're out hiking. And about the great snow of 1717, and we read about the woodchuck, with the last kill of in the sunny sward, woodchuck, and Hugh Quoil, Fan Quoil, the Irishman, and we are reading Walden because it is our want. And you get your wit from the soul powder. And somebody asked to write a book about New England rum. And we talked about how we were going to plant walnut trees and become tree planters. The tree bombs from airplanes, 1 billion of them. 1 billion walnut trees we're planting. And this is a section on former inhabitants and winter visitors, which we read as a cheerful morning reading by no fireplace. We spent, so you can listen to it, was cheerful winter evenings by your fireplace. We read in Walden Pond.